I never thought a gravel driveway could become the most important piece of leverage I would ever have against a neighbor, but that's exactly what happened. The funny part is that I didn't build a fence, I didn't hire a lawyer right away, and I definitely didn't stand outside screaming at construction workers like some reality TV character. What I did was a lot quieter than that, and somehow it ended up causing a whole renovation project to grind almost to a complete stop. It started when the old farmhouse next door sold to a couple named Derek and Melissa. At least that's what I'll call them. Their property sat close enough to mine that from the road, it looked like our homes shared the same access area. We didn't. My driveway curved from the county road, crossed my land, and wrapped toward my garage before passing near their house. It had always been completely inside my property line. The survey was clear. The county records were clear. The previous owners knew it. I knew it. The only people who seemed confused about it were the new owners. Within days of moving in, they launched what looked like a full-scale renovation campaign. Dump trailers showed up. Roofing crews appeared. Delivery trucks rolled in every morning. It looked less like a home improvement project and more like somebody was rebuilding the place from the ground up. At first, I tried to be understanding. Renovations are messy. People need space. Sometimes a truck driver makes a wrong turn. I get it. So when I noticed a contractor using my driveway to turn around, I let it slide. When another van parked on the edge of my gravel for 10 minutes, I ignored it. I figured common courtesy would eventually kick in. It didn't. Instead, every week brought something new. One afternoon, a lumber delivery truck parked halfway across the entrance to my property while workers unloaded materials next door. Another morning, I found a portable dumpster sitting partly on my land, as if somebody had randomly decided my property was available for rent. The most irritating part wasn't even the inconvenience. It was the assumption. Nobody knocked on my door. Nobody asked permission. Nobody said, "Hey, would you mind if we used a portion of your driveway for a few days?" They simply acted as though access to my property was included in the purchase price of their house. Then things escalated. One morning, I stepped outside with a cup of coffee and nearly dropped it. Deep tire tracks cut across the grass beside my driveway. Not just one set either. Multiple vehicles had apparently decided backing onto the road required too much effort, so they drove across my lawn instead. The ground was torn up, patches of grass were flattened, and muddy ruts stretched toward the neighboring construction site. That was the moment I stopped viewing it as a misunderstanding. I walked over and found the site supervisor. He was standing near a stack of siding panels, checking something on a clipboard. I said, "Hey, we need to talk about the driveway." He looked up and smiled like we were discussing the weather. "Sure, what's up?" I pointed toward my property. "That's private land. Your crews keep using it, parking on it, and now they're driving through my grass." He nodded casually. Way too casually. Then he said something that still annoys me when I think about it. "Yeah, we're just using it during the renovation. It's safer for the guys." Safer for the guys. That was his explanation. Not an apology. Not a request. Just a statement. As if my property rights automatically became secondary to their convenience. I told him directly that the driveway wasn't part of their project and they needed to stop using it. He assured me he understood. For about 48 hours it looked like maybe the message got through. Then the trucks came back. The workers came back. The shortcuts came back. Every promise evaporated. Weeks passed. Every day seemed to bring another example of someone treating my driveway like public infrastructure. What really bothered me wasn't the physical damage. Gravel can be replaced. Grass can grow back. What bothered me was the attitude behind it. Derek and Melissa never approached me once. Not once. Instead, they acted like access was already theirs. Looking back now, I think they had convinced themselves the driveway was basically shared property because it made their renovation easier. That's the thing about entitlement. The longer people benefit from something they don't own, the more they start believing they deserve it. Eventually, I realized I was fighting the wrong battle. Every conversation ended the same way. Every warning got ignored. Every polite request disappeared into thin air. So one evening I sat down at my kitchen table, spread out my property records, and started asking a different question. Instead of wondering how to stop them from using my driveway, I started wondering why they were so confident they could keep using it. And when I finally found the answer, everything changed. Now let me pause the story for a second because this is where a lot of homeowners accidentally walk straight into trouble without realizing it. According to standard procedure, construction projects are supposed to identify legal access points before work begins, especially when heavy equipment, deliveries, and contractors are involved. That might sound boring, but it's actually one of the most important parts of a permit application. From a legal perspective, ownership doesn't disappear just because a shortcut is convenient. If a contractor repeatedly uses land they don't have permission to access, that can create liability issues, property damage claims, and in some cases permit compliance problems. But here's the part that fascinates me most. This is a psychological trap. Once people build a routine around a convenience, their brains stop treating it like a privilege and start treating it like a right. After enough deliveries, enough trucks, and enough workers crossing the same space, they stop asking whether they should be there at all. The lesson here is simple. When somebody repeatedly ignores a boundary, the real issue usually isn't the boundary itself, it's the assumption that no one will enforce it. And as I was about to discover, Derek and Melissa had built a lot more than their renovation schedule around that assumption. The next weekend I pulled out every document I had related to my property. Survey maps, county records, closing paperwork, old boundary sketches from when I first bought the place years ago. At first I was simply looking for confirmation that I wasn't missing something obvious. Maybe there was an easement I had forgotten about. Maybe some agreement existed between previous owners. Maybe there was a legitimate reason these people acted so confident every time they crossed onto my land. But the deeper I dug, the clearer everything became. There was no easement, no shared access agreement, no recorded right-of-way, nothing. My driveway belonged entirely to me. That should have been the end of it. But curiosity pushed me one step further. I started looking into the renovation permits that had been filed with the county. In my area, many permit records are public information, and after a little searching, I found the project documents connected to the neighboring property. I wasn't expecting much. Honestly, I thought I would just find generic paperwork. Instead, I found the reason nobody had taken my complaint seriously. There it was on one of the submitted site plans. A temporary construction access route. A neat little line sketched across the edge of my driveway and connecting directly to their project area. I stared at it for a full minute. Then I looked again. Then I compared it to my survey. The line wasn't close. It wasn't ambiguous. It wasn't a misunderstanding. Their renovation logistics had literally been designed around access they did not own. Suddenly, every conversation made sense. Every shrug, every smile, every dismissive response from the site supervisor. In their minds, my driveway wasn't somebody else's property. It was already part of the plan. The crazy thing was they had apparently never bothered to verify whether they actually had the legal right to use it. They simply built their entire construction strategy around an assumption. I remember sitting at my kitchen table laughing out loud. Not because the situation was funny, but because it was so unbelievably reckless. Imagine planning a road trip based on a bridge you never checked actually existed. That's essentially what they had done. At that point, I stopped arguing with contractors altogether. There was no reason to keep having the same conversation. The problem wasn't happening in the driveway. The problem was happening on paper. So I started documenting everything. I gathered photos of trucks parked along my gravel. Pictures of the dumpster sitting partially on my property. Images showing tire tracks carved through my lawn. I pulled security camera footage with timestamps. I organized everything into folders. Then I attached copies of my survey and the permit documents showing the access route. Once everything was assembled, I filed a formal complaint with the county building department. No drama, no threats, no emotional speeches, just facts. Then I waited. About a week later, I got a call from a county inspector. He had reviewed the documents and wanted clarification on a few details. We talked for maybe 15 minutes. I explained where the property line was located, where the vehicles had been entering, and how long the activity had been happening. He thanked me and said he would follow up. A few days after that, things started getting interesting. I noticed the inspector's vehicle parked next door. Then I saw him walking around with a clipboard studying measurements and comparing paperwork. The contractors looked noticeably less relaxed than usual. Nobody was smiling anymore. A week later, I got confirmation that the county had issued a compliance notice related to the project. The issue wasn't that a truck had accidentally crossed onto my land. The issue was much bigger. The approved renovation package included an access assumption that could not legally be supported. That transformed the situation from a neighborhood annoyance into a permit compliance problem. And permit compliance problems tend to get everyone's attention very quickly. According to the notice, They were required to immediately stop using my driveway for any construction-related access and submit revised plans reflecting legal site access. If they failed to do so, portions of their permit could be suspended until the issue was resolved. When word spread through the construction crew, the atmosphere changed overnight. The next morning, I watched workers standing around discussing alternative routes. A delivery truck arrived, and then sat there for nearly 20 minutes while people argued about where it could unload. Material that had previously been dropped close to the work area now had to be carried from the street. Equipment movements became slower. Scheduling became harder. Every shortcut they had relied upon vanished at the same time. A few days later, Derek finally came to my door. It was actually the first meaningful conversation we'd had since the renovation started. He knocked. I answered, and for a second neither of us spoke. Then he said, "You filed the complaint." I said I did. He looked frustrated. Not angry exactly, but frustrated in the way people get when consequences arrive after they've spent months assuming they never would. "You could have talked to us." I almost laughed. Instead I said, "I did talk to you. Multiple times." That answer seemed to hit harder than anything else. Because it was true. Every opportunity to avoid this situation had existed months earlier. They just ignored it. Derek tried another angle. "This is costing us a lot of time." I nodded. Using my property without permission was costing me patience. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to argue. Then his shoulders dropped. The conversation ended shortly afterward. There wasn't really anything left to debate. The county had already made its decision. Over the following weeks, the effects became impossible to miss. Deliveries slowed down. Labor costs increased. Workers spent more time transporting materials. The renovation schedule stretched further and further. Every day I watched the consequences unfold, not because I wanted revenge, but because logistics matter. When you remove a critical access point from a construction plan, everything downstream becomes more complicated. And that's exactly what happened. The most satisfying part wasn't seeing delays. It wasn't watching contractors struggle. It was seeing boundaries finally respected. No more trucks cutting across my property. No more workers treating my driveway like a public road. No more tire tracks in the grass. The behavior stopped almost immediately because the incentive structure changed. Once my driveway disappeared from the official plans, it effectively disappeared from the project itself. The convenience they had depended on for months was gone. The assumption they had built everything around collapsed. And all of it happened without a courtroom, without a shouting match, and without me ever placing a single obstacle in their path. The only thing I did was force reality to catch up with paperwork. A few months later, the renovation was finally finished, and if you drove past those houses today, you'd probably never guess there had been a conflict at all. The new siding was up, the roof looked great, the landscaping had recovered, and from the outside, everything appeared perfectly normal. But every time I pull into my driveway, I still think about what happened because the story was never really about gravel, construction trucks, or even difficult neighbors. It was about boundaries and how people react when a boundary is inconvenient. Looking back, I honestly don't think Derek and Melissa woke up one morning and decided they were going to take advantage of me. I think something more common happened. They became so focused on their project, their deadlines, their contractors, and their expenses that they slowly stopped seeing my property as belonging to someone else. What started as a shortcut became a habit. What became a habit turned into an expectation. And eventually that expectation transformed into entitlement. This is a psychological trap that shows up everywhere in life. The longer people benefit from something, the more likely they are to convince themselves they deserve it. That's why small boundary violations often grow into larger ones when they're ignored. The first truck becomes 10 trucks. The first shortcut becomes a permanent route. The first assumption becomes an accepted fact. From a legal perspective, none of that changes ownership. Paperwork may not be exciting, but property records, surveys, permits, and easements exist for a reason. They create clarity before disagreements become disasters. According to standard procedure, access rights should be confirmed before a project begins, not after someone discovers the project depends on land that isn't theirs. The lesson here is that being polite and being passive are not the same thing. For weeks I tried being patient. I tried having conversations. I gave people opportunities to correct the problem themselves. But eventually there comes a point where protecting your rights isn't rude, it's necessary. And here's the part one think matters most. I never, 1. because I was smarter than my neighbors. I never won because I had more money, more influence, or better lawyers. The situation resolved itself because facts were stronger than assumptions. Reality was stronger than convenience. Ownership was stronger than entitlement. That's why this story still sticks with me. The moment that changed everything wasn't when the county issued the notice. It wasn't when the truck stopped coming. It wasn't even when Derek showed up at my door. The moment that changed everything happened when I stopped arguing emotionally and started looking at the actual documents. That's where the real answer was hiding the entire time. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have handled it the same way? Would you have filed the complaint sooner? Or would you have given the neighbors even more chances? And if you were the homeowner running that renovation, would you assume access was available without written permission? Let me know in the comments because stories like this always spark debate. Some people believe neighbors should accommodate each other no matter what. Others believe property lines exist for a reason and should be respected from day one. Personally, I think mutual respect solves most problems long before government paperwork gets involved. But when respect disappears, paperwork has a funny way of bringing reality back into focus. And in my case, the driveway never physically moved an inch. The only thing that disappeared was the assumption that it belonged to anyone other than me.